Did you start writing quite early but publishing a little bit later, or was it something?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, the first time that somebody even mentioned the word, you know, to become a writer was when I was maybe 10 years old, going to primary school. And it was, I remember it was a Monday morning, and the teacher said, so please write an essay about what you did over the weekend. And of course, we knew that he didn't have time to prepare anything else. So he made us write something. And so I wrote about what I did that weekend. And I really enjoyed it. And I just couldn't stop. And then 2 days afterwards, he brought the essays back. And he decided that he wanted to read mine in front of the class, which he did. And then at the end, he said, Rolf, you know, there's something like a writer. That's a profession. And I thought, wow, that sounds interesting. I actually enjoy writing very much, and you can make a profession out of it. And some of that stuck in my head and has been with me ever since. And then I started especially reading again more when I went to secondary school, 14, 15. And then when I was 16, I had a terrible, what do you call it, motorbike accident. It was so bad that the doctors even thought I was going to be paralyzed for the rest of my life. And I was very active in playing soccer back then. And after I had that accident and the doctor thought that was it, I thought, wow, things can change so quickly. All of a sudden, everything that you thought was maybe possible is just being taken out under your feet, and you just keep falling down into some sort of an abyss. And I really had the luck that they decided not to operate on me. But it took me about a year or so to kind of recover from it. And I was always in pain and I was limping. And one day when I took the train to go to high school, which is called the Collegium, where I come from, because it used to be run by monks. A good friend of mine all of a sudden told me in the train, you know, you have a hard time. Why don't you start reading again? And he knew me quite well. So he gave me a book by a famous Swiss writer, Friedrich Dürrenmatt, who's mostly known also because of his plays that have been staged worldwide. And he gave me an essay by him that was called The Football Club of Helvetia of Switzerland. And in that essay, Friedrich Dürrenmatt summarized more or less the history of Switzerland in the perspective of it being actually a football club. Because football was important to me back then, and then all of a sudden somebody writes about soccer in such an interesting way, just blew me away. I thought it was awesome what I was able to read on that short train ride. And the same evening of that day, I went to a library, a bookshop, and bought the collected works of Dürrenmatt because he had just died then. And I started reading through all of them, and I was so fascinated. As soon as I was finished with that, I went back to buy the collected works of Max Frisch and just read all of them and was really fascinated by it. And then I started writing again. And I kept doing it. We had a group of friends that read text each other at the high school. We sometimes even went on in a cabin at the weekend and wrote and read to each other. And it was a great time for me to kind of discover writing again and have some sort of a small audience. You know, we would discuss the text and see what we were able to do. And as soon as I had to decide what I wanted to study, it was clear I wanted to study something with languages. So I did English and German literature. And I always wrote on the side. I had a diary that I wrote notes in. I had little stories I wrote, started to do some poetry. And I was kind of like a sponge back then, going to university, having all these great German poets just being thrown at me, more or less the same with the English and American poets. And there was so much to learn and so much to appreciate. And they kept stimulating me even after I was finished with the studies to then publish myself. I had enough stuff together that I thought, now I have something maybe to say that I would also like other people to read. I don't have to be kind of ashamed of what I published. This is kind of okay for me if somebody else reads it. Yeah, that's kind of how it went.
Extraordinary. And it's so extraordinary that you have that sense in your mind, the narrative of how you discovered it. And it seems to me a lot of people I've spoken to whose work is as rangy and innovative as yours is, because the first thing that really struck me about your work is that you seem to be applying original methodological approaches to different ways into poetry. Like, it seems like you're fascinated by the potential of poetry, the voice, the visual, the image around language, punctuation. These all seem to be parts of your work. And I've noticed, and it was true of me too,
Yeah.
a lot of people who do that, it's because they have a moment where they discover poetry, like, or it feels like poetry discovers them. So when you describe that, it sounds so much like it was like a real crystallizing moment. And do you think that that accident was a huge part of the narrative for you? That
Absolutely. I think first the accident was very important to kind of realize how fast things can just vanish that seem to be of great importance to you, and then you look for something that is maybe more stable or more secure in some ways. That was definitely an important thing. And then of course having that friend who at such a lucky moment for me just gave me that book, and I was able to read it, and I was so fascinated by it. I also have to say that one other thing that is very important for me when I started to discover writing has actually been my grandmother. My grandmother was born in 1915, many years ago. She died 6 years ago. And she was a farmer, a housewife, had a not always easy life up in a small mountain village, you know, living off cows and the garden and the trees, so to speak. And she started writing when she was about 50 years old. And she's always she told me that. I interviewed her for quite a long time. I made a radio play about her with a good friend of mine. We did a radio play in my grandma. And she actually said that she always wanted to be a writer her entire life, but she couldn't. But she kept writing and writing. And she usually did that when the kids were asleep. And she had finished up the cleanup, if you want. The house was in order. And then she finally had some time to write. And she usually wrote when the moon was shining. It's somewhat interesting how all of that comes together with her. And I remember when we were kids, we often visited my grandmother because she was really important to all of us. And then, you know, you were sitting at a table, and uncles, aunts were there, cousins, some people from the village, my parents, my two brothers were there. And it was always wild and beautifully chaotic. You know, some people talked about what had happened in the village. Somebody wants to sell the house that they have. Somebody has to take chemotherapy. Some kids didn't behave the way they should have, or whatever. And then there was always an aunt telling really dirty jokes in front of all those kids. It didn't matter, and we just listened and didn't quite understand what was going on, but we knew there was something else obviously out there that maybe one day we will also be able to understand. And then out in the midst of that chaos, my grandmother would just take the fist and hit it on the table and say, "Now quiet." And everybody just, you know, froze. And then the grandmother said, "Now I want to read you a poem that I just finished." And the grandmother was there. Everybody was listening. All the noise, it just subsided. It was completely quiet. And then she wrote one of her texts. And it was always so extremely touching to me, because in all that chaos, all of a sudden you could feel somebody reading in a voice that was really her own voice. And that really touched me, and it still touches me just thinking about it. You always had the feeling you were very close to something extremely intimate, but also something that transcended intimacy. It goes much farther than just, you know, somebody wants to tell you about what they just experienced. It's something that is there for everybody to feel and appreciate and take in. Yeah, and it enriches you. It really enriches you to a great extreme.
Wow,
So that was, I think, the accident was important. You know, getting that book by my friend was important, but what has maybe been the most important thing is actually the grandmother, and seeing that somebody writes and taking it somewhat seriously.
It's an incredibly cinematic memory and scene that you set. I mean, it's so vivid, and it must have definitely informed your sense of authenticity to have your grandmother not creating poems for a market or as a job or as an idea that way, but for her family and also in the mountains. And you'd mentioned before that you grew up in a very rural, was it quite mountainous area?
Absolutely. That's where you find the highest mountains in Switzerland. Like the Matterhorn is not too far away from there. Yeah, that's kind of that part of Switzerland.
So that must have had an effect on you too, because your whole consciousness, your whole reality is somehow separate from you know, the city and from the urban development. So that transition must have also been part of discovering literature as a profession, as an engagement, must have been part of that switch from the rural mountainous reality.
Oh yeah. I mean, the first time I actually saw somebody read his own text after my grandma did it, and she was not a professional that way, was I think when I was 20 years old. I went to a literature festival that started taking place not too far away from where I grew up, like the International Literature Festival in Leukerbad. They have it every year. It's a beautiful festival. And I went there 20, 21 years old. And that was the first time I saw a poet, a writer, read his own stuff. And I thought, my grandma was right. They're not all dead. They actually live and they try to make a living from it. So that's all true. But before they were, I didn't see any poets. I knew that there were some musicians around. But it was something that that also stuck with me, to see somebody in that kind of a literary field presenting his or her own text. It was wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, and it must have changed your perception of a lot of things. I mean, to grow up in such a unique, and obviously there's so many stereotypes for people who don't come from mountainous regions about what mountains symbolize, about scale, human beings perceiving nature as something much bigger than their mortality. But it must have had an effect on the way then you brought that into traveling to America, living in the cities. Do you think it's come through in your work, through your life?
I think it has. I think I'm trying to connect lots of different things that, they have to do with my origin, but they also have to do with what I've experienced since. Being in America for a while has affected me greatly. Living in spending all that time in the Valais where I grew up had a deep effect on me, not only through my parents and my brothers and the beauty of its surrounding and the sublimity of the surrounding. It's quite something. I also worked as a shepherd for 7 years up in the mountains, which was important for me as well. And that also goes into the work. But I think as long as I'm able to combine all these different things in a way that also amazes me, that they fit together, I enjoy writing very, very much. As soon as I would, play one out against the other, then I would not feel like I should write anymore. They somehow have to become all part of one big thing. I think that's what matters. So growing up there, and being overwhelmed by the mass of that nature that just seems to go up all the way to the sky sometimes, it seems, and then seeing those flat plains in Iowa where you just see the sun so beautifully and so huge going down. All of that has to be somewhat present in the work if it's possible, and that's what I'm trying to work on, to combine these different things. Yeah.
Well, I think it's an enormous credit to you that discovering your work, albeit in translation because of my limited language skills, in no way did you seem like someone who has taken those physical experiences and those environments and perhaps extrapolated them into the human observing the nature. Your work is very synthetic, it's very layered, it's very complex. It seems to be very aware of language and the medium of poetry itself, which is a huge credit to you, because it would be very easy, perhaps, with your remarkable life experiences and where you're from, to observe and be just the human eye as a poet, which obviously is an enormous tradition. So it's fascinating to hear that. How old were you when you were a shepherd? I have to ask that. It's not a literary question, but how did you spend 7 years shepherding?
Seven summers, to be exact. I started doing it when I was 20. Wow. And I finished it the last time I went was when I was 27. And it was just, back then, it was a great way, not only spending the summers and being so closely connected to nature, but also making money as a student. So that was also nice. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I did it the first year I did it with a good friend. And it's the same guy actually that gave me that book on Dürrenmatt. All of a sudden he asked me, I remember him telling me that he couldn't stand being up there alone anymore. He was too scared. You're up on 2,500 meters above sea level. So you're high up and you're quite remote from everything. There might be a few cow herders much farther down, but you're not really connected to people. You're really there on your own. And he just couldn't take the solitude. He was really scared. He was also a bit superstitious. That didn't help. And he was able to do it for 1 year. And then he realized the second year alone is not possible. So I did 1 year with him. Then I did 3 summers completely alone with a great dog. And then I also did 3 more summers, maybe 4 summers with my wife that I met back in America. Yeah.
Wow. What a
Yeah,
remarkable
it was
experience.
An unforgettable time. Yeah, an unforgettable time.
Completely unique in every single way. That's amazing. That friend, you owe him a chocolate bar, I think. Oh my God.
At least, yeah, at least.
That's a true friend. I mean, oh my God, he gives you
No, it's funny that some all of a sudden the same people, turn up in very 2 important occasions in my life and just gave them a slightly different direction. It's quite something, yeah.
That really is. He's a real buddy. That guy. That's amazing. Well, I'm definitely.
Also, just to say this, even though growing up in a mountainous area, very rural, which is very true, I also grew up very close to the language border. The canton I grew up is like bilingual. You speak a dialect that is German, which I usually speak, and then the bigger part of the whole canton speaks French. So when we, for example, went shopping, we got into the car of my dad and just drove across the language border, still being in the same canton of Switzerland, but then people start speaking French. So it's for me, it was always so fascinating that it takes so little and you can just transport yourself in a relatively different or completely different surrounding. That's something I always loved. And then you just, even though your parents grew up in that really small mountain village with 250 people, as soon as you cross the border and you go to a town of maybe 7,000 people, not that big either, but all of a sudden you have the strange feeling, Paris is not that far away anymore. So all of a sudden, just going 10 minutes in a car opens up such a wide horizon.
Wow.
That was always there. It was great. Yeah.
The contrasts are remarkable. I mean, geographic contrasts, but then linguistic too. I mean, this is something I've spoken to quite a few Swiss poets about, which is the operation of the 4 different linguistic areas within Switzerland. I mean, it's not unique to Switzerland, but Switzerland has a unique connection to it in terms of a sense of literature. Because I was going to pick up with you, Max Frisch, Friedrich Dürrenmatt, and perhaps Robert Walser are the 3, like in the UK, the 3 German Swiss language writers that, in a way, I'm jealous of because of we don't have equivalent to, especially someone like Robert Walser. But that's then interesting in terms of the languages that they're writing in and how they're more known than some Swiss, French, Francophone, or especially Swiss Italian. So I'm interested in that then. How has that really affected your writing fundamentally? Because if you can operate as a young human being around different linguistic universes, that must fundamentally change your mode, your method in terms of writing poetry.
I think it really has. I remember especially when I was in America, and started to discover the American poetry. I love Emily Dickinson to this day. I love William Carlos Williams a lot. I love Frank O'Hara, Walt Whitman. I love all of them very much. And they kind of definitely affected maybe my first book of poetry quite a lot. I thought the vastness of what they were able to transport into their poetry was something that really interested me. I mean, how can you have a poem that goes on for so long? Like Frank O'Hara with 4 or 5 pages of poetry. And it kind of challenged me to rethink what poetry could be. I mean, this idea of shortness that is still present in Emily Dickinson, of course, but then was changed by Walt Whitman, I think, and also the later William Carlos Williams definitely had an impact on me. I was still then writing rather short poetry. I mean, 8 lines, I was happy. Sometimes 20 lines, I was happy, but I didn't go much farther than that. But that the possibility is there, and that maybe the idea of poetry is a lot more open than what we are usually taught in school, in high school or so, was always there. And I think it still affects me to this day. At the moment, I'm writing a long poem, which is something new to me, but it may still go back to discovering some of those early poets in my life, I need to say, back in the States. And it just challenged my idea of what poetry could be about. I think that definitely had something to do with it as well. I also wanted to start studying French, I remember, so that I could actually be able to write Arthur Rimbaud and Baudelaire in the original. I did it for 1 year and then I realized it's going to take too long. It was so much better than me. So why do it? And then, spend years and years in it and maybe never reach that level. But that was also there at the beginning. I love the French language as well. I love the Italian languages. I love a lot of languages, but to achieve a skill that makes it possible to read it like I would be able to read German was almost impossible. So I'm able to read English poets in the original most of the time, and I like that a lot. I also did it in my studies. It's gotten a bit rusty, unfortunately, since then, but it was always great to read that as well. But I think being open to lots of different traditions and seeing what happens in other countries has definitely enriched my sense of what poetry could be. Maybe I could put it together like that.
Yeah, there is a slight irony there that you're in an environment that has multiple languages and also dialects of those languages and also a fourth Swiss language, Romansh, and then it's going to American English, which gives you that energy. I mean, it makes a lot of sense, actually. There's a paradox in there, which I can relate to too, which you require something outside of what you're given without choice. And it feels like a lot of, as you describe your story, so much of it is about chance presenting you with choice, that you have to then say, this is something I'm going to do, and this is how I'm going to do it.
Yeah. I mean, it's like kind of a fox going through the forest, and all of a sudden he sniffs on something and goes, whoa, this is great. And then you just follow it, and you go through with it, and you just, how should I say, you just go as far as you can with it and see what it does to you as well. I mean, it's not only that you discover something, but somebody discovers you, as you said it before as well. And then in following that scent, you may discover some new sides of yourself as well. And that is, I think, always absolutely fascinating, that you discover yourself as being something expanding in some ways. And that is just, if that happens, it's wonderful.
Yeah. And I think one has to be open to that. And that's often what people's styles of poetry are about, in my experiences. A lot of the people I've had the privilege to invite to my festival or I've collaborated with, that's almost all I need to have in common with them, is that the aperture is open for the idea to arrive towards them. And they don't have a preset vision of what poetry is, what creativity is, what experience is, and I think that seems very resonant in your work, because all the stories that you've been so generous to tell, they lead us up to the innovation that seems to be really present in your work. So it makes a lot of sense.
It also happened with prose, and I somebody asked me all of a sudden to write a prose text for what is it called, like a literary hiking book, so to speak. And I thought, well, how many characters do you need? And then they said, well, it should be at least 20,000 characters, empty characters, whatever you say, included. So a total 20,000. I thought, my God, that's going to take me 5 years. That's how long a book of my poems is about. And I value and try to figure out every word and every sound you try to understand, and it has to make sense. So I tried for a week, and that just didn't get anywhere. And all of a sudden I thought, I'm just going to call him and say, this is it. I'm not going to be able to do that. And all of a sudden, I remembered a scene with my grandma, because it was actually a hike taking me from one place to the place where my grandparents live, especially my grandma. And all of a sudden I just realized, if I go back into myself, into some areas I remember quite clearly, then it starts floating. And all of a sudden the text was done in 2 days. And I thought, that's something I never expected. And since then I also started prose, and I put together a book of stories, if you want, that came out 2 or 3 years ago. So that's something else I discovered, also because someone else asked me to do something. So I've become, I think, very aware to what people ask me to do. And even though my first instinct is usually to say, no, I just want to do one thing, I have enough to do, I'm opening up to other suggestions and see where they take me to as well. And there's a lot to discover.
Yeah, I can definitely feel that in your approach towards poetry, and it's something also I share. And I think it's it's a human decision. It's not so much about writing. When I talk to a lot of people about that in different fields, it's just a way of navigating the world. You know, are you open to new opportunities? I mean, there's limits to us all, but it's something I definitely share. So you mentioned your first book, which I think came out in 2007. Is that right?
Yes. Yeah. That was...
What was that experience like then, finally, after all this journey with your grandmother and your accident, and you have this book arrive? Was it something that fulfilled your ambitions, or was it a strange experience?
It was a very happy day for me.
Nice.
It was great. I started reading in front of audiences before a little bit. I even did poetry slams for a while. Tried to become a member of the spoken word scene in Switzerland. And then it was another author that recommended me to his publishing house. And then I knew now it's the time to put those poems together. And I'd written a lot of stuff by then. And I was able to select the things that I wanted. And I was very happy when it came out. It was wonderful. And I was also lucky enough to have a publisher that was willing to put some of my collages, the pictures and images that I made in that book as well. So I still remember the first presentation of that book was in an art gallery. And it was really beautiful for me, because the guy who owned the art gallery also had the pictures of me up on the wall. They were there for a week, and I was able to present a book in the midst of those collages, which was beautiful for me. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Very important step, yeah.
and how did your collage practice begin? Did it happen alongside your written poems, or was it something that you set out to do?
It was more like back then when I was not able to continue with poetry, I wanted something else to do that had to do with art. And so what I started to do was I started to collect paintings that you find in calendars, like just copies of famous paintings, cut those apart and then mix them with pictures that I took or pictures that I found in newspapers. And then sometimes you take items of 7 different pictures and you put them together into something new. It was always really, how do you just say, a nice moment for me was when I decided who had actually made the picture. So I invented the painter's name. It was always something new, something different, and what the picture could be called. And then also where they would exhibit it. So it was kind of like, it was a fake. I mean, I faked the name of the painter. And I don't have an example here, unfortunately. And the title does not exist. And always where you would find it, maybe in the Tate Gallery in London or something like that. And then also the size, just those little things that you find under the pictures in museum. That's exactly what I wanted to have as well. And that became as important as the picture itself.
Yeah, I've read about this. It's your museum catalogue, I think it was.
Yes, exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
That's exciting to me, because not only then are you engaging in collage, which is a complex art form in the 21st century, because it's seen as such a 20th century innovation, and a lot of people see it as this, it's fixed in time with this Kurt Schwitter's Dada kind of appearance. But then there's some really exciting work happening on collage, which is often put outside of poetry. In the UK anyway, it's, even if it's linguistic, it's often put into visual arts. But I personally see collage as a fundamental part of 21st century poetry. And by that, I mean both linguistic and visual. So hearing your work was really exciting for me, but then also hearing that you'd created these fantastical narratives. Did you design them for people to truly believe that these were or did you acknowledge that they were slightly fantasy?
It sometimes happens that people, after they bought the book, they said, "Is that really true? You can go and see that stuff?" And then, of course, I didn't want to burst their bubble. Say, "Oh yeah, you got to go see it. It's right there in front of you if you go to that museum." Yeah. And other people, of course, immediately understood the joke. But it was somehow something that I really enjoyed doing for quite a while. I kind of stopped doing it lately because I started doing lots of different things in literature. Back then it was really collage or poetry or a bit of spoken word. And now it's like poetry or prose, spoken word. And then I'm also part of 2 groups that we perform together on stage. And that has taken up quite a bit of time. And all of a sudden this idea of the collages, which was really important for me, I think maybe for 10, 12 years, has kind of gone away. It also had to do with getting a stipend somewhere else. And I wasn't able to take all those big suitcases with all that material, with the pictures and the paintings with me. And then I had that stipend for a while. I think it was in Germany, then Paris later on. And that just kind of went away. Maybe it will come back again, but at the moment it's not so present as it was back when I did the first 3 books of poems, poetry.
I think it's really exciting to hear all these things have a natural rhythm, I suppose, in the work that we do, but that you were so concerned naturally with the visual and with the sonic. It sounds like with you doing lots of performances and radio plays, it sounds like the voice and performance is important to you. Did that happen because you were involved in that before you published your book, or is it something natural, do you think, that you like to express things live?
I mean, the first time I did it, I was so terrified. I was sweating bullets for 2 weeks. And then after I did it for the first time, and for some silly reason, I decided to do a bit of singing, read a poetry, and then read something in my dialect. And of course, the singing was such a terrible idea because it scared me even more, but I had the will to do it.
Sounds good.
People thought it was weird, especially the singing part.
That sounds good to me.
But I think it had to be that way back then. I've enjoyed reading in front of people always. I could not actually imagine just writing something for a book and that's it. I do want to go on stage and present the stuff, and I want to be part of what I write in front of people. I think that's also where some of the uniqueness can sometimes comes from, that you can connect the person who wrote the stuff to what he's reading out of his own book. I mean, that's, yeah, if you can bring those 3 things somewhat together in a writing, and people appreciate it, and they can value it as something new to them and appreciate it, I think it's a wonderful, wonderful thing. To bring the book to life with your own voice is just fantastic. Whether it being some piece in dialect that I write or read, or a prose text or poetry, it doesn't matter what I present when I'm on the stage, but to me it's so important that I have this idea already in my head when I start writing it. I want to present it. I want to be in front of people with that stuff.
Extraordinary. I can see why. You're incredibly eloquent, so I can see that you have that connection of communication, and it's a different dimension, I think, to interrogate that's just full of potential. And a lot of my reading about your work too talks about linguistic innovation, especially around grammar and punctuation. So is that a journey from your debut to your work now? Has your linguistic style changed a lot?
I think it has changed. I think when I started with the first book of poetry, there were narrative elements in there that I think have spilled now over into my prose. I think there were like humorous spoken word or comical spoken word sequences there that spilled over more into the spoken word that I do. There were also more lyrical poetry things there that worked with sounds more, maybe with rhythm more. But it was like a mix of these 3 different things that I do now, not completely separately, but more separately than back then. I think that's kind of changed. They kind of branched off into slightly different fields. That's what I would say. And after I started writing prose, the next step would then be to try to write a long poem. So somehow they don't only branch off, but they kind of overlap, and they meander around each other and touch each other again and influence each other again. It's how should I call it? It's a living organism somehow, that is going on there, I think. And I see that more and more.
Yeah, it sounds like an organic development.
Yeah, organic is a nice word. Yeah.
And do you have a poem that you wouldn't mind reading for us today? That would be a perfect time if we're talking about the evolution of your work on the page. That would be very generous of you.
I would love to read maybe one that goes back. I think it's in the second or the first book of poetry.
Wonderful.
It's a love poem.
Perfect.
Yeah, I just read the English translation, and just to say this, it was translated by a wonderful poet, Paul Henry Campbell, who's an American poet living in Germany, and he is a wonderful poet on his own, but he's also a great translator, I think. And it's called North of Alexandria. Are we walking on sand or treading on snow. Just after 5, when the first train leaves the station and buses are floating, circling on their routes, it is early February in Alexandria, cloudy in the low 60s with light showers, and unnoticeably, Sunday sneaks up on Saturday, and my breath onto yours. You say from dreams nobody has become full so far, and pass a glass of water on to me. Again, we go to bed in an inexperienced day. That would be it. There was one word is difficult to pronounce, unnoticeably. Sorry about that.
Don't apologize. There's nothing more beautiful than the fact that that reading is itself and will never be repeated. And the unnoticeably is the perfect. That's the best thing about reading. Also, you read wonderfully, and it's a very beautiful poem. So thank you so much. Don't apologize. It's been such a joy to chat with you, Rolf.
Likewise.
You've been so generous, and your work is remarkable, as is your understanding of it. So it's such a joy for me to be able to have a chat with you and get to know you a little bit. I hope one day soon we'll meet in person.
I hope so too, very, very much. Yeah, I hope so very much. Let's get that vaccination and then move on. Yeah.
That's the best line ever to end a video interview. Let's get the vaccination and we can move on.
It was great talking to you. Thank you so much, Stephen.
Oh, it was so my pleasure. You're so eloquent. Very generous of you, Rolf. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon, I hope.
Yeah, I hope so too. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Rolf. Bye-bye.